Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. I am Sumit Bhatia, Vice President at ARS Steels, a leading manufacturer of premium quality green steel rebars in India. India's steel growth is being driven by long products with the induction furnace at its core. This ecosystem has a very unique opportunity to play a key role in the transition towards low carbon steel making, low carbon emission steel making. In this presentation, I'll briefly talk about India's steel market and also touch upon demand, scrap dynamics, and the role of electric induction furnace in shaping India's green steel journey. And this is exactly what will define the future of green steel. What we are witnessing today is a fundamental shift in the steel industry. For decades, steel competitiveness was driven by quality, cost, and scale. But today, this is changing. Steel is no longer just about quality. It is increasingly about low carbon emission. At the same time, scrap, the key raw material for producing low carbon emission steel, is no longer abundant. It is a very strategic resource. In simple terms, we are moving from a steel market to a carbon market, and going forward, future competitiveness will be built on the access to scrap, how you secure scrap. Building on this shift, we are already seeing clear signs of tightening of global scrap trade. Scrap exports today are highly concentrated in few regions, mainly in Europe and the US. If we look at Europe, it has historically been the largest exporter of scrap globally, with exports reaching around 19.5 million tons in 2021. Since then, exports have declined to around 17.5 million tons in 2022 and further to around 16 to 17 million tons in recent years, because they are retaining more of scrap for their own domestic use, for their local mills to decarbonize. Similarly, in the US, scrap exports have also started declining from around 14.5 million tons of scrap exports in 2024 to about 12 million tons in 2025, which is the lowest level in nearly 2 decades, again, driven by rising domestic consumption. So this decline is not cyclical, it is structural. These regions are increasing domestic scrap consumption as they move towards decarbonization. And also at the same time, there is a strong policy push to retain scrap within the country. So in fact, globally, more than 60 countries have introduced export restrictions, and discussions around export levies and tighter controls are increasing, as scrap is being seen a very strategic raw material. So going forward, scrap will not just flow, it will be secured. And this matters a lot for fast-growing countries like market like India. Now, let me put the scale of the industry into perspective. Today, global steel production is around 1.8 to 1.9 billion tons, and this is expected to grow to 2.2 to 2.5 billion tons by 2050. At the same time, steel accounts for nearly 7% of the global emissions, so the industry has to grow while also decarbonizing. What is important to note that just the growth, not just the growth, but the nature of growth. It is becoming long-term and infrastructure-led, driven by urbanization and the energy transition, with India, Southeast Asia, and Africa leading in incremental demand. On the production side, the shift is equally important. Today, the BF route dominates at around 70%, but this is gradually declining. In contrast, EAF and IF routes are expected to increase from around 30% to nearly 50% by 2070. And this is where the scrap moves from a commodity to a strategic policy-driven research. This transition is being driven by scrap availability, decarbonization policy, and the broader energy transition. What we're now seeing is a fundamental shift in global trade dynamics. Trade barriers are not just about tariffs, they are increasingly becoming carbon-driven barriers. In Europe, the EU emissions trading system is putting a direct price on the carbon, with carbon prices in the range of euro 70 to 100 per ton of CO2. For carbon-intensive steel production, this can translate to roughly 80 euros to 100 euros per ton of additional cost, which is a significant impact on the competitiveness. So effectively, we are seeing a shift. Steel trade is moving from cost-driven to carbon-driven competitiveness. And if carbon is now directly linked to cost, the next question is, how are producers adapting to this new reality? So let me bring India into context. India's per capita steel consumption is around 98 kgs, about one third of the global average, and only around 20% of developed economies, clearly indicating a strong headroom for growth. Under the national steel policy, which was introduced a couple of years back by the union government, India is targeting around 160 kgs of per capita steel consumption by 2030. This means that India is entering into a structural growth phase with demand expected to reach around 200 million tons by 2030, growing at about a 6% CAGR. Construction and infrastructure drive nearly 60 to 65% of demand, and much of this is long products like rebar. And as demand of long product increases, the requirement for key raw material also increases. And while this demand outlook is very strong, sustaining this growth will depend on how efficiently we utilize the raw materials, especially the recycled steel scrap. So the key question is, how is India positioned on scrap utilization? Building on India's strong demand growth, we are also seeing a sharp increase in raw material requirement. Crude steel production to grow to 220 to 30 million tons by 2030, and which is nearly 35% growth, slightly higher than domestic demand, reflecting exports and capacity expansion. India is already world's largest producer of DRI, accounting for more than 50% of global DRI output, and it plays a critical role in supporting India's largely induction furnace-based long product production. At the same time, coking coal remains equally important because significant portion of India's steel production still comes from the BF route. As a result, India remains 80 to 85% dependent on coking coal imports, highlighting the unique dual nature of its steel-making ecosystem, where India is both a global leader in DRI and at the same time highly dependent on imported coal. And alongside DRI in coal, scrap is also becoming increasingly important, but that is where a structural gap begins to emerge. India's steel production currently at 150, 165 million tons, but scrap utilization is only 23% compared to the global average. Compared to global average of around 32% and much lower than developed economies, where scrap usage is typically in the range of 50 to 70%, and even higher in markets like Turkey at around 80%, over 80%. To put this into context, India consumed around 42 million tons of recycled steel scrap in year 25, out of which only about 33 million tons was generated domestically, and nearly 9 million tons was imported. So this shows that India is structurally dependent on scrap imports, even at current levels of production. If we look at steel demand growth across major economies today, there is a structural shift underway. Historically, China was the primary growth driver with very high growth rates in the early 2000s. But this has slowed significantly over time and even turned negative in recent years, we have seen in the presentation. At the same time, developed markets are seeing very limited growth, typically around 1 to 2%, indicating demand saturation. In contrast, India is emerging as the fastest growing major steel market with strong and consistent growth momentum. India has recently announced its union budget. The central government has announced its union budget, and they have allocated around $140 billion towards capital expenditure, which is around 3.1% of the GDP, and making us one of the largest infrastructure investment country program globally. And this trend is clearly visible in the latest March 26 data across 69 countries, accounting for nearly 98% of global production. Steel output declined by around 4.2% year on year, largely driven by China, where output fell by around 6%. In contrast, India continued to grow by around 9 to 10%, reinforcing its position as the fastest growing major steel producer. As we look ahead, the gap between scrap demand and availability becomes very clear. India's steel production, when we see India's steel production and the growth in the coming years, and under the national steel policy, India is targeting around 300 million tons of steel capacity by 2030, which will further drive demand for raw materials. However, scrap availability does not grow at the same space because scrap is generated from the steel which was used 2-3 decades before. And today, India is in a phase where steel is being used to build infrastructure and long life assets, which means less material is coming back as scrap. As a result, even the domestic supply will improve. It will not be sufficient to meet demand, and the deficit could reach 40 to 45 million tons by 2040. The tightening scrap market is clearly visible in the pricing trends. Imported containerized shredded scrap at CFR Nava Shiva has moved from around $400 per ton in 2025 to about 346 in late 2025, and now rebounded to around 365, 390 levels per ton. At the same time, HMS 8020 prices moved from 320 $345 per ton pre-war to about 345 to 370 dollars per ton, reflecting tightening supply. And these imports largely come from US and Europe, making them sensitive to freight costs and global market disruptions. Steel output is growing faster than hot metal, indicating slow shift away from purely blast furnace-led production. India has over 1,200 induction furnaces, which primarily depend on DRI as the base metallic input for long products. India produced around 58 million tons of DRI in 2025 and expected to cross 60 million tons in 2026, making it the largest producer globally. From a cost perspective, domestically produced DRI operates at around 320 to $360 per ton, whereas scrap varies by grade. HMS 8020 is around 345 to $370 per ton, and shredded is at around 365 to 390, making DRI a more stable and cost-effective input. It is also important to note that Indian DRI is coal-based and supports the IEF, whereas Middle Eastern DRI is gas-based. In terms of cost, Indian DRI operates at around 280 to roughly around $300 per ton, while the Middle Eastern DRI is around 320 to $350 per ton, offering a cost advantage for India, but with higher emissions. So Indian DRI comes with very, very high emissions. As we saw in the previous slide, scrap availability is becoming important for India's growth. The government has recognized this challenge and introduced a national steel scrap recycling policy, which focuses on formalizing scrap collection, developing shredding and processing infra, and improving quality and traceability of the scrap. Alongside these initiatives, the policy is also linked to vehicle scrappage policy and is expected to bring more end-of-life vehicle inside the formal recycling ecosystem, which will improve the overall scrap quality. Over the time, these efforts can help scale scrap availability from around 40-45 million tons today towards 60 to 70 million tons, supporting a more efficient and organized market. And this creates a very, very strong foundation for the next phase of India's steel sector. India's coking coal imports continue to grow in line with steel production, with total imports at around 63 million tons in 2025, up about 20% year on year. India imports 90% of its coking coal requirement, and this dependence is expected to continue. While the government is working on increasing coal washing capacity, it can only partially improve usability, and import dependence cannot be improved significantly, reduced. At the same time, there is an opportunity to reduce emissions through higher use of PCI coal, which can cut coke consumption by around 30 to 50% and improve cost efficiency. However, PCI coal is also largely imported mainly from Australia and Russia, and its higher adoption requires blast furnace upgrades and optional adjustments. So this clearly highlights that coal will remain a critical and import-dependent input in India's steel-making ecosystem. Yeah, this is same coal. Okay. Yeah, so if we look at scrap consumption in India, induction furnaces account for more than 50%, around 21 million tons out of the 41 million tons scrap consumption. In terms of steel production, induction furnace contributes around 55 to 60 million tons annually, accounting for roughly 35 to 40% of India's total steel output. Out of this, nearly 80 to 85% is long products, which means around 45 to 50 million tons of rebar and structurals are produced through the IF route. This clearly establishes induction furnace producers are the backbone of India's long steel segment. At the same time, India's metallic mix remains DRI-led, with scrap as complementary input, and induction furnace producers operate on flexible model, adjusting the DRI scrap mix based on the market economics. And this flexibility allows them to absorb the domestic and imported scrap efficiently, while maintaining cost competitiveness. A small slide on the role of green hydrogen. I think John has already covered in his slide, but just to share some context on the role of green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is often seen as key decarbonization pathway we have seen in the earlier presentation. However, the actual impact in current process is limited around 8% reduction in BF route, and only about 1.5 to 2% reduction in the rotary kiln DRI route. So this shows that partial hydrogen substitution does not reduce the emissions in the existing configuration. Also, as per the latest study, around 14 kgs of green hydrogen is required per ton of steel in blast furnace, and the most commercially viable technology today is priced at $7 kg, translating a cost of around $100 per ton on the steel produced through green hydrogen. India estimates around $300 billion required for the green hydrogen infrastructure to be built, and the estimated premium, as per recent study, was somewhere around $200 on green steel produced through green hydrogen. So now, where does India stands in the CO2 emission steel? Now, if we compare globally, India's emissions are the highest at around 2.55 tons of CO2 per ton of finished steel, largely due to the intensive use of coal in steel making. In contrast, scrap-based steel making can reduce CO2 emissions to around 0.6 to 0.7 tons, creating a difference of nearly 1.5 to 1.8 tons of CO2 per ton of finished steel. And at current EU ETS carbon price of Euro 70 per ton of CO2, this translates into a cost advantage of around 100 euros to 125 euros. So there is a clean impact, financial benefit of using scrap in electric induction furnace. Some multiple drivers for decarbonization in steel companies. Decarbonization is in India's steel sector is being driven by multiple forces. From market side, requirements are evolving now. Customers are talking about net zero targets, green building certifications. Public procurement has been recently introduced in India, green public procurement policy, starting from 2027. In the infrastructure projects, minimum 30% quota has been given for green steel. It has to be utilized. On the export side, regulations like EU CBAM and EPD requirements are making carbon a key factor for market access. Domestically, frameworks like BRSR, Business Responsibility and Sustainability Reporting, and CCTS, Carbon Credit Trading Scheme, are driving greater transparency and traceability towards emissions. So, and from a capital perspective market, investors are increasingly linking funding and cost of capital from sustainability performance. Developers in India are talking about sustainability, they're talking about green building, they're talking about transparency and authentic data. Green steel demand is projected to grow from around 4 to 5 million tons by 2030 to nearly 180 million tons by 2050. Construction and infra together account for 60 to 65% of this demand, which is roughly around 110 million tons by 2050 of steel requirement. This translates directly into long products demand of around 100 million tons, making the segment the most dominant with regards to green steel. Ministry of Steel has recently introduced green steel taxonomy. India is the first country globally to really define what is green steel. The greenness of the steel will be determined on the emission intensity of the plant. The rating has been given 3, 4, and 5 star. With 5-star rating, steel produced with less than 1.6 tons of CO2 per ton of finished steel is defined as green steel. We have represented to government to make 7-star and 8-star rating also. I'll cover in next slides. So this is our green steel. For producing green steel, we also need green energy. And India has placed very ambitious targets. So India's renewable energy capacity has scaled up immensely with wind and solar capacity increasing from around 35, 40 gigawatt in 2015 to about 150 to 200 gigawatt today, reflecting a 4 to 5 times increase over the past decade. In addition, if we look at the broader picture, total renewable energy capacity, including hydro and other sources, has now reached to around 280 gigawatts. On green hydrogen, India has launched a national green hydrogen mission with an outlay of around $5.2 billion, targeting 5 million tons of green hydrogen production by 2030. The government is providing direct incentives to produce green hydrogen, along with around $500 million support for electrolyzer manufacturing at a national level. A key enabler in this is the waiver of grid transmission and wheeling charges for renewable power used in green hydrogen production for up to 25 years, reducing cost of power significantly. So by way of introduction, ARS is located in southern part of India. We have over 46 years of experience and expertise in procurement of premium quality raw material. The current installed capacity to produce rebar is 276,000 tons per annum. By early next year, we'll be producing 0.4 million tons of green steel, and by 2030, aspire to produce 1 million ton of green steel rebars. What makes us truly green steel? At present, we utilize over 98% premium quality recycled steel with less than 2% of DRI, with a very, very impressive material yield of over 95%. We have invested a lot into scrap processing and recycling machinery. As a result, our yield is around 96.4%. We have best-in-class electricity consumption of around 725 kilowatt hour per ton on manufacturing of rebars. This includes TMT rebar as well as billet. We are using green power for our production. We have invested around 45 million USD in captive renewable and captive wind projects. This is the formula for green steel, which is renewable energy, recycled steel, and no fossil fuel is equal to green steel. In the entire manufacturing process, in our plant, we do not burn even a single kg of fossil fuel. We lead in the world CO2 emissions. At present, my CO2 emission is around 0.5 kgs of CO2 per ton of steel. We have developed this third-party digital tracking tool, which is linked to our internal data systems, and we calculate our CO2 emissions basis the WSA, World Steel Association, and GHG protocol calculations. We publish our EPD. We are CBAM ready. We can do CBAM calculation certifications through this portal. This provides complete transparency and visibility to the end customer. We are also working, and we have also developed blockchain, providing complete end-to-end transparency to the end customers for export market. These are our green credentials. We have EPD. ARS is #1 green steel manufacturer in India today. We were the first recipient of this green steel certificate. You can see in the middle of the screen. We are the only manufacturer from India to have green steel certificate, leader category from Singapore Green Building Council. As Singapore as a country, they have their own mandates that whatever construction they do, whatever infra they build, it has to be green. So for them to use green material, it must be SGBC certified. So we are SGBC certified. So this is our emission intensity, how we are working. We are at 0.59 right now. This year, we will be producing steel at 0.3 kgs of CO2 per ton of steel by using, again, recycled steel, renewable energy, and incorporating battery storage to make sure that we use almost 85 to 90% renewable power in our electricity consumption. By 2028, we aspire to be net zero. And as per Ministry of Steel, India has set target of becoming net zero by 2070. So we are around 40 years ahead on the journey of producing green steel. So what are the key takeaways? To summarize, scrap availability is tightening structurally, and global trade flows are becoming more controlled. In this context, India's induction furnace route offers a clear advantage with flexibility to use DRI in scrap, enabling a faster transition towards low carbon emission steel. It is also important to note that the capex for the BOF route is typically 3 to 5 times higher than the IF route, while the IF route remains far more capital efficient and scalable, making it better suited for rapid adoption of green steel making ecosystem. we are moving from a steel market to a carbon market, and scrap is becoming the bridge between the two, especially in long products, and where the transition will be most visible. Yeah. Thank you very much.